You need a home. We need a mama. She heard it like someone had set a heavy stone right in the center of her chest. In front of her, two children stood close, their thin shoulders trembling, but their eyes holding steady. The older boy's hands, dirt-stained and small, gripped the strap of a worn canvas satchel as he tried to keep his voice from breaking. The younger one, hair tangled from the wind, leaned her head against her brother's shoulder, lips pressed tight as if afraid that letting go would mean the tears would fall. They didn't know she'd just been left at the station. They didn't know the wound in her heart was still so raw that even the lightest touch hurt. But in their eyes, she saw the same hollow ache she carried herself, the fear of being forgotten, of being left behind. Out here in the West, sometimes a simple offer can turn the course of an entire life. Stay a while, because this story has only just begun. Montana Territory, winter of 1886. The sky hung heavy and gunmetal gray over the far hills, clouds gathering as if to swallow the little town of Red Willow whole. Since dawn, the wind had shifted, carrying a bone-dry cold down from the north, whipping against the depot's timber siding and slipping through every crack in the doors. Snow didn't just fall, it blew sideways, spinning in tight funnels with grit and shards of ice, rattling anything not tied down. Train number 17. From the east screeched into the station, iron wheels grinding against the rails, white steam billowing only to be shredded by the wind a heartbeat later. The last passengers stepped off in a hurry, scarves pulled high, heads ducked, rushing toward the faint glow and warmth of the waiting room stove. Among them was one who didn't move with the crowd. Maggie Lane. She stepped down onto the planks of the platform and felt the heat vanish from her feet in the span of a single breath. The blue coat she'd once been proud to wear out of Boston had faded, its sleeves frayed, the hem stiff with a crust of ice. One hand gripped the strap of a canvas satchel, everything she had left after the long journey, while the other pressed the brim of her wool hat against the wind. Her eyes searched. A tall, lean frame in a brown hat? A face she'd only seen in a faded photograph tucked in an old letter? Nothing. Only strangers. A young man carrying a child. An old woman bent double pulling a carpet bag. Two native traders exchanging goods with the station agent. No sign of George Harlow, the man who had written to say he'd be here. The wind whistled in her ears, laced with the smell of damp timber and rust off the rails. Far down the platform, the train board swung on its chains, creaking in slow, uneven beats like her own heart, heavy, uncertain, unsteady. The engine gave one last mournful whistle before the cars rolled out, leaving behind a hollow space where the noise had been. Maggie realized she was among the last still standing outside. The ticket man, scarf wound tight around his neck, passed her with a polite nod, never slowing. She turned toward the depot's front windows, fogged over from the heat inside. It would be warmer in there, but her boots stayed planted. The letter had been clear. Wait on the platform. I'll know you the moment I see you. She had read those words over and over during the trip, steadying herself each time with the thought that a new beginning was waiting at the end. But here, under the iron sky and the bite of the wind, those words felt no heavier than faint ink on a creased scrap of paper. A sudden gust caught the tail of her coat, flinging fine snow into her face like a scatter of pins. She hunched against it, tightening her grip on the satchel. Her gloved fingers were going numb. She drew a long breath, trying to keep it even, but her breath came out white and faster than she meant it to. On the bench against the wall, A young couple gathered, their things, shouldered their bags, and hurried away. A cowboy strode past, boots striking the boards with a dry, ringing thud. No one looked at her. Not once. From the ticket office, the agent, 40-ish, frost catching in his beard, leaned out the door. "You waitin' on someone?" he asked, voice rough from the cold. Maggie nodded, keeping her voice steady. "I'm waiting for a man named George Harlow. He said he'd be here to meet me." The man frowned, shook his head. "Ain't seen anyone by that name today. If he don't show, you'd best find shelter quick. This cold'll do you no favors. Hotels are full up. Boarding houses too, most likely." With that, he pulled his scarf tighter and went back inside, leaving her alone among the patches of ice mottling the platform. Maggie bit down lightly on her lip, feeling a knot pull tighter in her gut. She had come more than 2,000 miles for this, leaving behind crowded city streets, the ring of church bells in the morning, stone-paved walkways, to stand here, in a place where the wind could carry her away without anyone knowing her name. A long whistle moaned somewhere beyond the tree line as the wind shifted again. Snow thickened, clinging to the hem of her skirt. She hugged the satchel close, scanning the platform one last time, hoping for a late-arriving figure heading her way. But there were only strangers, hurrying off into the white haze. Back in Boston, she'd imagined Montana as the kind of beginning told in stories. Wide fields, endless sky, and a home where someone waited. But now, all she had was a wind-scoured platform and the icy groan of rusted hinges. She shut her eyes for a moment, drew in the bitter air. "No," she told herself, "don't panic." Maggie Lane had never let herself crumble over a promise left unkept. But when she opened her eyes, the world was still blurred by snow, and deep down, she knew she was about to make a choice. Stay and wait, or turn and walk toward some other road. The ticket agent had gone back to his window, but before he shut the wooden door, he called out once more. "Hotels are full, and I wouldn't count on a boarding house having space either. It's dropped below freezing. Stay out here too long and it'll get dangerous. If nobody's coming, best find shelter now." Maggie gave a small nod, though her eyes kept sweeping the platform, reflexive, as if George Harlow might suddenly emerge from the blur of snow, striding toward her with a sheepish smile for being late. But the long stretch of planks was emptying fast, only strangers slipping into narrow streets where oil lamps glowed faintly through the frost. A fresh gust rattled the train board on its chains, making it groan louder. Maggie pulled her collar higher, feeling the cold start to worm its way past the thick cloth. For a moment, she considered stepping inside to warm herself and think. Then, from the far edge of the platform, she saw two small shapes moving toward her. Children. They came on through the wind in skittering swirls of snow. The older one, a girl of 8 or 9, wore a loose braid, with stray strands whipping across her flushed cheeks. Her bare hands were red to the point of purple, but still clutched the handle of a small wicker basket. Beside her was a boy, no more than 5, cheeks bright from the cold, lips pressed tight, wide dark eyes fixed on Maggie without blinking. The girl stopped in front of her, chin lifted in a way not often seen in children. Her voice carried, calm and certain, as though stating a simple fact. "You need a home. We need a mama." Maggie froze. The wind swept sideways, tossing strands of hair from beneath her knit cap, but she hardly noticed. Those words rang clearer than any other sound on the platform. Before she could speak, The girl raised the basket, a small hand pushing it toward her. Inside, nestled among scraps of cloth and a withered apple, was an envelope. Her name, Margaret Lane, was written in neat, slightly slanted letters, the hand of an adult. She reached for it slowly, the cold of the paper cutting through her glove. "This is for me?" she asked quietly. The girl's eyes never left hers. "They said to give it to you. We've had it since morning." Maggie unfolded the envelope. Inside was a single sheet, folded in half. No greeting, no signature, just a short message. "George Harlow was arrested in Helena last week. Fraud. Don't look for him. Find another way." The words seemed to freeze on the page, sharper than the wind pressing through the station boards. A different kind of chill ran through her, one that had nothing to do with the weather. There was no sender's name, no postmark. Someone here had known she was coming, known she was looking for George, and had chosen to tell her this way. The girl still stood there, gripping the basket as if afraid Maggie might hand the letter back. The boy edged closer to his sister, his tiny hand fisting the hem of her coat for warmth. Maggie crouched to meet their eyes. "Who gave this to you?" The girl shrugged slightly. "A man in a black hat. He said a lady in a blue coat would step off the midday train and we should give it to her. Then, he said to take you home." Maggie frowned. "Home? Whose home?" "Ours." Pause. "Your pa?" "Samuel Carter. He's looking for a wife, but he had work in the fields today, couldn't come to the depot. Told us if we found you, we should give you the letter and invite you back. He won't turn you away." Maggie shook her head slightly, caught between surprise and caution. "But I've never met your pa." The girl tilted her head, a quick smile flickering across her face. Not playful, but certain. "You'll know him when you see him, and he'll know you. We've been waiting for someone like you." The boy glanced up, murmuring softly, "We've got a fireplace. It's cold out here, ma'am." Another blast of wind swept across the platform, sending scraps of paper skittering against Maggie's skirt. She looked at them, red cheeks, runny noses, thin coats, and worn boots, and knew they couldn't stand here long. Part of her wanted to turn away, to find a boarding house or any place with thick walls and a locked door. But another part, the one holding that letter, knowing George Harlow would never come, pushed her toward the small hand being offered. "Where do you live?" Maggie asked, her voice softer now. "Past the white willows, down the road with the leaning fence. Not far." The ticket agent stepped out again, collar pulled high, glancing over the three of them. "If you're going, best go now. Sun's about to drop. Nobody should be out when the wind turns." Maggie looked down at the girl's hand, cold enough to be nearly white, but steady all the same. She drew a breath and placed her own hand in it. The girl's smile widened. "I'm Clara. This is my brother Jacob." "Maggie," she said, hearing her name spoken into the north wind as if it were something new. Clara nodded, tightening her grip. "Then let's go. Pa will be waiting." They left the platform, three small figures vanishing into the curtain of snow, leaving behind the creak of the train board and the cold sinking into every grain of wood. The road ahead was still hidden, but in Maggie's chest, a new direction had begun to take shape. Not the one she'd planned from Boston, but maybe the only one left. Once they stepped beyond the depot, the wind was no longer held back by timber walls or overhanging eaves. It hit full in the face, carrying snowflakes sharp as glass. Maggie tightened her scarf at her throat, but felt at once the pull of two small hands leading her forward. Clara walked ahead, quick but steady, her head tipped to break the wind. Jacob stayed close at her side, the other hand still pinching the hem of his sister's coat like a habit older than he was. Both moved as if they knew every stone and hollow in the road out of town. Maggie, a stranger to the way, had to match her steps to theirs, hearing the stiff soles of her boots creak on the skim of ice. They crossed the main street, little more than a single row of wooden buildings, the general store, the smithy, and the saloon already shuttered against the coming dark. Light spilled from a few windows, warm and gold, but in the wind that light felt as distant as a summer dream. "Just keep following me," Clara called over her shoulder, her voice carried thin in the gale. "Once we pass the willows, we're close." Maggie lifted her gaze. Far off, at the edge of town, tall trees rose with their branches heavy under snow, swaying faintly with each push of the wind. As they drew nearer, the sound beneath their feet shifted, from the dry scrape of ice to the muffled crunch of ground, shielded from the worst of the cold. The willows arched over the road, branches bending down and weaving into a pale canopy. When the wind found its way through, snow sifted from above in soft bursts, settling on Maggie's shoulders and clinging to her hair. The air here was quieter, the bite of the wind dulled, leaving only the sound of their breathing and the occasional creak of wood in the trees. Jacob leaned toward his sister, murmuring something the wind swallowed whole. Maggie caught only Clara's small nod before they fell silent again. Even as children, they moved with the self-reliance of those who had grown up in the lonely spaces of this land. No need for many words, only the steady rhythm of walking together. When they stepped out from the willows, the world opened wide. The dirt road led to a leaning fence, its boards silvered with age and patched with rope. Beyond lay an expanse of land, ringed by winter-dead grass under a quilt of snow. At its center stood a low wooden house, its roof blanketed white, a thin ribbon of chimney smoke curling into the leaden sky. "We're here," Clara said, and this time she turned to smile at Maggie. It wasn't bright, but it was honest, a welcome measured and real. The gate opened with a soft groan of hinges. They crossed the yard, climbed the worn middle plank of the porch steps. Clara pushed the door open, and warmth poured out, wrapping around them like a heavy quilt. In the doorway stood a man, Samuel Carter. He was tall and broad-shouldered, in a thick gray work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. Snow clung to the fabric and the short black hair at his temples, melting in slow drops. His eyes met Maggie's for a heartbeat, steady, without probing or haste. Then he stepped aside, motioning her in. "Come on in," he said, voice low and rough, like timber that had seen many winters. Maggie stepped across the threshold, her boots heavy with snow, and was at once surrounded by the smell of wood smoke and the faint, savory salt of a stew on the boil. To the left, a cast-iron stove glowed red, its firelight licking across split pine walls and giving the small room a gentle brightness. Clara and Jacob shed their coats, hung them by the door, and scurried to sit near the stove. Maggie lingered until Samuel came over, pulled a chair closer to the fire. "Sit here," he said simply, before turning to the long pine table, ladling a brimming bowl of stew from the iron pot, and setting it before her. Steam curled upward, blurring the frost at the window beside her. The scent of onion, carrot, and slow-cooked meat stirred the hunger she'd been ignoring since stepping off the train. "Thank you," she murmured. Samuel only nodded, his expression unchanged since the moment he'd opened the door. No questions. No demand to know who she was or why she'd been standing on the depot platform in the teeth of a north wind. She sat, feeling the heat from the stove seep through the layers of cloth and into her skin. Across the room, Clara whispered something to Jacob, and both looked her way before trading quick, quiet giggles. The first spoonful was a comfort all its own, the salt just right, the meat rich, the vegetables sweet in a way only winter root can be. Warmth spread through her throat, settling deep in her belly as though it could thaw her from the inside out. Samuel returned to the stove, set a few more logs to the fire, then took a seat by the window. He drew a small knife from his pocket, picked up a block of wood, and began to carve with slow, certain strokes, movements steady enough to be almost hypnotic. In that moment, Maggie understood. This wasn't an offer or a promise. It was a kind of silence that didn't push away, a quiet allowance to be here, without needing to explain. And after a day spent in the lash of the wind and the cold truth of George Harlow's arrest, that was enough. Mornings at the Carter place always began before the sun came up. Maggie woke to the rustle of wind threading through the roof timbers and the faint gray light creeping past the rough linen curtain. Her room was small, just enough space for a narrow bed, a wooden chest at its foot, and a small table by the window. From there, if she pulled the curtain aside, she could see the white willows draped in snow and beyond them, the trail leading back toward town. Each morning, the first bite of cold still made her shrink deeper into the blankets for a few stolen minutes. But soon, out of habit she hadn't had before, she pulled on a thick wool sweater, wrapped the scarf Clara had given her that first day, and stepped into the hallway. The walk to the kitchen always came with the scent of wood smoke, a smell that had begun to mean safety. Samuel was usually gone by then, out before she even stirred. But there was always a mug of black coffee waiting at her place at the table, still warm. No one mentioned it, but every time she wrapped her hands around the cup, she felt the heat travel from her palms straight to her chest, a language without words. The children rose later, running barefoot into the kitchen, hair tangled, eyes still heavy with sleep. Clara was quick to fetch her brother warm milk. Jacob would sit by the stove, rubbing at his eyes, waiting for the sting to leave his toes. Maggie didn't feel like a guest, though she wasn't quite mistress of the house either. Her hands had learned the motions of pouring milk, slicing bread, setting down the midday soup. On days when the sun showed itself, though the cold stayed sharp, she opened the kitchen window to let in a softer breeze while she mended clothes, listening to the wind thread through the willows. The work in the house seemed to divide itself naturally. Samuel took the outside. She kept the inside. They'd never spoken of such an arrangement, but it settled between them like a shared breath. Maggie spent much of her time sewing. The elbow of Samuel's shirt had split. She closed it with small, neat stitches, never perfect, but strong. Jacob's trousers were worn thin at the knees. She patched them with heavy cloth. Clara's dress had frayed at the hem. She cut it and shaped it into something better fitting. With each pull of the needle, it felt as though she was mending not just cloth, but some unseen gap in the hearts of all three. By mid-morning, she cleared the table, laying out scraps of paper, a stub of pencil, and a nearly spent ink bottle. Clara would sit at once, chin in hand, eyes alight. Jacob was slower, but pulled a chair close. Maggie wrote letters slowly, reading each aloud so they could repeat them. Sometimes Clara missed a word and laughed, pulling Jacob into her giggles until the kitchen seemed brighter than the fire itself. Samuel was rarely home in those hours, out in the fields, checking fence lines, splitting logs, or taking the horses down to the river. Yet somehow, when Maggie set the table for the noon meal, there was always a place for him, as if he knew exactly when he'd be back. One afternoon, with the last light sliding toward gold and a few snowflakes drifting down, Maggie decided to put the pantry in order. She shifted jars of beans, sugar, and flour, wiping a thin layer of dust from the shelves. When she slid an old tin aside, she found a small wooden box, its latch worn but holding. The hinge stuck, but after a bit of effort, the lid gave way. Inside, on a faded scrap of blue velvet, lay a slender, well-crafted silver bracelet. On its inner band, she read the inscription, Elise Carter. Beneath the name was a date. She froze. It matched the whispers she'd caught in town. The disappearance of Samuel's wife, one winter morning years ago. Folks said Elise had gone to market and never come back. No one knew what happened. Only rumors remained, and a silence whenever her name was spoken. Maggie ran her finger over the cool silver. The bracelet was almost unmarked, as if its wearer had treasured it. Why was it here, tucked among beans and flour? Why not kept with other keepsakes, somewhere in plain sight? A hard gust rattled the door, making the stacked jars tremble. Startled, she shut the box, latched it, and slid it back, turning the tin to hide it from view. Light footsteps sounded behind her. "Miss Maggie, are you done? Where's my dress?" Clara's voice was bright. Maggie smiled, keeping her tone even. "Almost. Bring it here, let's see." The girl handed it over, then dashed away. Maggie watched her go, feeling both relieved Samuel hadn't returned yet and aware of a new thread of curiosity winding itself tighter inside her. That night, they ate bean soup with crusty bread. Clara and Jacob took turns telling about their games that afternoon. Samuel nodded now and then, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Maggie listened, though her eyes sometimes drifted toward him, wondering if somewhere behind them he carried the shape of Elise. When the children were in bed, the house settled into the golden lamplight and the soft crack of wood in the stove. Maggie sat by the fire, mending Samuel's shirt with slow, deliberate stitches. At the table, Samuel worked a small block of wood with his pocket knife, shaping it into a bird. The faint scent of fresh shavings mingled with the smoke. They spoke little, but the quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like two people moving at different rhythms toward the same end, keeping this house warm while the wind still hissed through the willows outside. In that light, Maggie knew she was still only a long-term guest. But when she tied off the final stitch and he set the finished bird on the table, both paused, as if wordlessly admitting that, at least for this winter, they had become part of the same new rhythm. That morning, Samuel left a short note beside Maggie's coffee cup. "Go to town. Get more flour, salt, and a few other things." The handwriting was firm, like the way he spoke. Clara and Jacob had gone early to play with the neighbors' children. Outside, the snow in the yard had been shoveled into two narrow paths leading to the main road. Maggie pulled on her thickest coat, wrapped her scarf high over her chin, and stepped out. The wind wasn't as fierce as it had been, but the cold bit deeper, turning her breath into pale clouds. Samuel was waiting beside the wagon. The gray horse stamped its hooves in the snow, its breath steaming in twin plumes. He offered his hand to help her up, the movement quick and sure, then flicked the reins. The wagon wheels rolled over frozen ground with a low, steady crunch. They didn't speak much on the way. The sounds were the wind, the horses' hooves, and the occasional jingle of the reins. Maggie watched the land pass, fields sleeping under a white quilt, fence lines running on without end, the faint haze of mountains on the far horizon. Red Willow came into view as a small cluster of wooden buildings gathered in the middle of the snowbound plain. The main street stretched only a few hundred paces, flanked by the blacksmiths, the seamstresses, the saloon, and Cole's Mercantile, the store everyone came to at least once a week. Samuel tied the horse to a post near the door. A bell above it chimed as they stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold with them. The air was warmer here. A stove glowed in the corner, the smell of ground coffee mixing with new fabric and lamp oil. Wooden shelves held sacks of flour, jars of preserves, bars of soap, coils of rope, and boxes of nails. Maggie hung back while Samuel went to the counter. She was about to glance through the bolts of cloth when the gaze of Harriet Cole, tall, thin, somewhere near 50, with a wine-colored wool shawl, caught hers. Harriet's smile came slow, not quite friendly. "Well," Harriet said, her voice pitched just loud enough for the nearest shoppers to hear, "if it isn't Miss Maggie Lane, I hear you've settled in at the Carter place." Maggie felt other eyes turn toward her. A man comparing nails at the side shelf paused. A young woman near the door glanced over quickly before pretending to look. Harriet tilted her head, her eyes traveling from Maggie's scarf to her worn boots. "That was quick. New in town, already living with a man, and with children, no less." The words were light as air, but cold enough to cut through wool. Maggie heard them clearly, but before she could respond, Samuel returned from the counter with a sack of flour. He said nothing, setting it down on the counter along with salt, coffee, and nails. Harriet's smile widened as she glanced at him. "I suppose you're very pleased with this new arrangement?" Samuel laid the money on the counter, his tone even but short. "Just the things on the list." Harriet lifted a shoulder, as if she'd pricked at something and found no reaction. She turned to her own parcels, but her eyes still held that spark, the look of someone who'd lit a small fire and was waiting to see it spread. Maggie felt something in Samuel's silence she couldn't quite name. It wasn't avoidance. It was more like a wall, solid and high, keeping the wind out. A wall that shut Harriet away. But it shut her out too. They left the store without a word. The bell chimed again, and the street's cold air rushed in. Samuel loaded the bags into the wagon, helped her up just as he had before. On the ride back, the wind carried the sharp scent of pine from the trees along the road. Maggie sat quietly, her hands clasped in her lap. She felt warmed by the fact that Samuel hadn't answered Harriet's barb. But there was an emptiness in the way he said nothing at all to wash the words away. Back at the house, Samuel carried the goods into the kitchen. Maggie hung her coat on the wall peg, the lingering feeling still with her, that she had just stepped out of a place where every word was weighed by someone else's eyes. And she knew those eyes would be there every time she set foot in town. That afternoon, the sky carried the weight of a coming storm. The wind shifted, bringing the damp scent of melting snow, and the low gray clouds seemed ready to press down on the rooftops. Maggie was feeding more wood to the stove when a sharp knock rattled the door. On the porch stood a red-headed boy, the blacksmith's son, cheeks flushed from the cold, holding a folded scrap of paper. Miss Maggie, the schoolmaster asked me to bring this. Maggie wiped her hands on her apron and unfolded the note. The slanted hand of Mr. Callum read, "Please have Mr. Carter come see me tomorrow morning regarding an incident involving Clara at school. Concerned a scuffle with another pupil. J. Callum." She read it twice. A scuffle? Clara was lively but gentle, never one to start trouble. Folding the paper again, a thin thread of unease wound through her. Samuel came home at dusk, snow dusting the brim of his hat. Maggie handed him the note. He read it once, face unreadable, and said only, "I'll speak to Mr. Callum in the morning." "You know what happened?" Maggie asked. "No, but I'll find out." He hung his hat, shrugged out of his coat, and stepped into the washroom as though the matter was settled. By the time Samuel left the next morning, Maggie's mind had already turned the note over a dozen ways. Near midday, he returned, with Clara trailing behind. The girl moved quick into the house, head down, dress wrinkled, braid half undone. Maggie caught a smudge on her skirt and the faint stain of red along her sleeve. Without a word, Clara slipped into her room. Samuel hung up his coat and finally spoke. She fought with a boy in her class, split his lip. The boy's father wants her suspended for a week. Maggie stared. "But why?" Samuel leaned against the wall, his gray eyes cool. "The boy said you were just here to keep my bed warm. Clara told him to take it back. He didn't. So, she swung." The words cut like a small, sharp blade, not deep, but cold. Shame and hurt settled in Maggie's chest. She turned away, clasping her hands tight. "So, I'm the reason she's in trouble." Samuel didn't answer right away. The crackle of the fire filled the space between them. At last he said, "She made her own choice. I couldn't stop her." It did nothing to lift the weight from Maggie's shoulders. She spent the afternoon in the kitchen, scrubbing, washing, doing anything to keep from picturing Clara in that schoolyard, face flushed with anger at the insult. Night fell fast, swallowing what little light remained. Supper was a quiet affair. Clara silent, Jacob subdued. Samuel moved through the evening as if nothing had shifted. But Maggie knew something unseen had slipped between the walls of this house. When the children were asleep, Maggie stood by the stove, a cup of cold tea in her hands. Staring into the flames, her mind drifted back to Boston. Those first days in Montana when she'd felt the weight of judgment. And now, realizing it had never truly left. In her room, she pulled out the wooden chest, lifted the lid. A few folded dresses, a wool cap, a thin shawl, easy to pack into the same canvas bag she'd carried when she arrived. The thought of leaving was no longer a passing wind. It had begun to stitch itself together in her mind, one thread at a time. She was bending over the chest when she caught a faint sound from the front room. Not hurried footsteps, slower, steadier, the rhythm of thread drawn through cloth. She stepped into the kitchen doorway and stopped. Samuel sat at the table under the slant of lamplight, broad shoulders bent slightly forward. In his hands was Jacob's deep red wool scarf, its edge frayed and worn. A needle flashed between his fingers, drawing a thread near the color of the yarn. He leaned closer to his work, eyes following each stitch as if it were the most important thing he'd done all day. His rough, calloused hands moved with care, pulling the thread through, snugging it just enough to close the gap without puckering the wool. No one was there to see him do it. No need to prove he could tend to the small things. He could easily have handed it to Maggie. Since she'd come, she'd mended every bit of clothing in the house. But tonight, he didn't. Maggie stayed in the shadows, her shoulder against the doorframe. The stove popped softly, firelight painting his face in gold and shadow, his silhouette steady and still against the wall. After a time, he set the needle down, studied the mended edge, and folded the scarf neatly. Maggie slipped back into the hallway before he could lift his head. In her room, she placed the folded clothes back in the chest and closed the lid. Lying in bed, she could still hear the sound of thread pulling through wool, a reminder that not all care is spoken aloud, and sometimes it's the silence that holds someone in place. The next day, when Jacob looped the scarf around his neck, he noticed nothing but its extra warmth. Clara returned to school when her suspension ended, her gaze toward Maggie softer, as if to say, "I don't regret it." Maggie said nothing, just smiled, but felt part of her resolve to leave melt away, like ice meeting flame. The morning cold at the depot cut straight through Maggie's old wool sweater, finding her skin like a thin blade. Snow from the night before had been trampled into dirty gray slush along the walkways. People stood in small knots, shoulders hunched, breath clouding the air in short puffs. The train whistle had only just faded, leaving behind the scrape of wind against weathered signboards. Maggie had only meant to stop for a coil of hemp rope from the shop beside the depot, but she slowed when she caught the sound of two men's voices drifting from behind a stack of freight crates by the fence. One man wore his felt hat low, leaning toward the other as if to keep the talk between them, though the way they chuckled made it clear they wanted to be overheard. "Heard a lawyer's coming down from Helena next week," the first man drawled, slow and rough, chewing over each word. "Carter's land's about to get interesting. Who holds that much without the town's papers in order?" The second voice was sharper, sliding in. "I heard they're gonna dig up that whole living in sin business of his. Give the council an excuse, they'll take the land as easy as snapping kindling." They laughed, a short, dry crackle like brittle wood breaking. Maggie stood behind the wall, her fingers tightening on the handle of her basket. The words, though only scraps, cut along the grain of her mind. Since setting foot in this town, she'd grown used to sidelong glances and stray remarks in the market or at church. But this was no longer just idle gossip. If what they said held truth, it was enough to strip away everything Samuel had kept. She turned away slowly, stepping out onto the main street. Each step felt heavier, sinking into the churn of mud and ice. At the hitching rail, Samuel stood by the wagon, holding the reins. He didn't urge her along, just looked at her in that quiet way of his. But today, the silence seemed deeper, like a lake whose bottom was nothing but sharp stone she'd never seen. On the way home, the wind blew fine snow back into their faces. Samuel said little, and Maggie couldn't find a place to begin. She wanted to tell him what she'd heard, but feared she'd only be throwing a spark onto embers not yet cold. Near the house, Samuel tied the horse under the shed roof and carried the sack of flour into the kitchen. Maggie hung her coat, set down her paw basket, the weight in her chest still pressing. He lit the stove. The wood snapped and hissed. "Something wrong?" Samuel asked without turning. His voice was steady, not urgent, but enough to tell her he'd noticed. She hesitated, then said, "I heard folks saying a lawyer's coming. They mentioned your land." He set the log down and faced her. There was no flash of anger, no real surprise, more the look of a man hearing aloud what he'd already known. "In this town," he said, "rumors grow without planting, but sometimes they're sown on purpose." The truth in that told her he'd known for some time, and had likely been preparing in his own way. But she also understood that no matter how strong he was, everything could still be lost if the law was bent far enough by those with the power and the will. The next morning, Samuel left early, saying he had to check the north fence line. Maggie stayed behind, mending one of his work shirts. The slide of the needle through fabric brought back the image of him by the fire that night, sewing Jacob's scarf. Perhaps, like him, she was trying, however small, to protect what she could keep. By late afternoon, Samuel returned, mud on his sleeves, his hands red and swollen from the cold. She wanted to ask what he'd found, but he only drank a glass of water, then went out to split wood. His choice of silence left her both reassured and outside some circle she couldn't step into. That night, the wind rattled the roof and worried at the window frames. Maggie lay awake, the image of those two men at the depot looping in her mind. She began to imagine the worst, that the town might turn fully against Samuel, and that she, the outsider, would be blamed. Part of her thought of packing her things and leaving before it happened, the way she'd left other places that had never wanted her. But another part refused. Some things, if you walk away from them, will heal only as scars that never fade. At dawn, when Samuel went to the barn, Maggie pulled on her coat and followed. She didn't speak of leaving, nor of the rumors. Instead, she helped him clean the feed troughs, dragging out bales of hay. When he paused to rest, leaning on a post, she asked quietly, "If the lawyer does come, is there anything you want me to do?" Samuel looked at her, his gaze unhurried, as if weighing a reply that couldn't be made lightly. At last he shook his head. "Just don't believe what they say. And don't leave." The words were so plain they nearly weren't enough, and yet they warmed her chest against the cold air. He wasn't promising victory, or that he could shield her from everything. He was asking her to stay. That was enough to tell her that, despite the distance between them, he counted her part of his fight. In the days that followed, Maggie began paying more attention to the undercurrents of the town. Who spoke to whom, which conversations happened in the corners of the market, and who suddenly stopped greeting Samuel. Piece by piece, the signs could form a clearer picture. And she knew that if she meant to stay, she'd have to learn to read the language of this land, the kind written in guarded nods and half-finished sentences. The white wind of a frontier winter wasn't like any other wind. It wasn't just cold. It carried a quiet weight, as if the miles of snow it swept over held the buried stories of generations past. That afternoon, with the sun sinking low along the horizon and painting a faint ribbon of amber to the west, Maggie noticed that the stillness inside the house had lasted too long. The small footsteps of Jacob, usually racing circles around the porch, his laughter slipping in through the door cracks, were absent. At first she thought he might be busy with the stack of wood blocks Samuel had cut for him the day before. But as the light outside thickened into a dense gray, and the first flakes began to whirl down like salt from an unseen hand, a tightness took hold in her chest. She called his name softly and got nothing back but the wind's reply. Samuel had gone out to check the southern fence and hadn't yet returned. Maggie wrapped another layer of scarf around her neck, pulled on the thickest coat she had, and stepped onto the porch. It took only a few paces before she saw them, small footprints pressed into the fresh snow, heading in a straight line toward the stand of birches, a short distance from the house. She remembered Jacob's fondness for a little wooden horse Samuel had carved for him when he could barely walk. The paint was long chipped, but it went everywhere with him, out to the well, beside the stove. That morning she'd half heard him say something about the horse wanting to go for a walk. Now it was clear. He'd gone to find it just as the wind began to rise. Each of Maggie's steps sank deep as she crossed the thicker drifts. The wind pushed against her from the trees, stinging her face with fine, sharp snow. Every breath she exhaled came out as a white cloud, snatched away immediately. She bent to follow the tracks. At first, they were clean and sharp. The closer she drew to the woods, the more the wind blurred them. By the time she reached the birch grove, the snow was near her knees. The trees stood still and pale, their white trunks like thin columns holding up a sky heavy with cloud. Here, the air was so hushed it seemed to pull every sound away, leaving only her heartbeat and the whisper of her coat brushing against itself. Then she saw him. Jacob was tucked against the split trunk of a birch, its bark scoured rough and thin by the east wind. His wool cap had slipped sideways, his hair damp from the cold. The wooden horse sagged in his hands, dusted with snow. He wasn't crying, but his body shook in small, uneven bursts. His eyes were wide, startled to see her, as if it hadn't occurred to him anyone would come looking. Maggie didn't speak. She dropped to her knees and wrapped him inside her coat, holding tight until the warmth from her body began to pass into his. As soon as the heavy fabric touched his skin, Jacob's breathing came stronger, like he'd found the safe place he'd been searching for. Maggie lowered her head, her lips near his ear, and hummed an old lullaby, one her mother used to sing on windy nights in the Missouri grasslands. Her voice was low, just enough to muffle the hiss of the wind around them. She didn't know how long they stayed like that. Only when she felt warmth seeping back into his small hands did she help him to his feet. One arm she kept around him, the other clutching the wooden horse. Step by slow step, they made their way out of the grove, now buried under a fresh layer of snow. What stopped her wasn't exhaustion. It was what she saw along the tree line. Beneath a thin dusting of snow lay a string of hoof prints. Not from the old gelding in Samuel's barn. She knew its stride by heart. These were from another horse, shod recently, circling the very spot where Jacob had been sitting. The spacing between the prints told her the animal had stood for a long moment before turning and heading away, in the opposite direction from the house. She crouched, studying them closely. The edges were still sharp, meaning whoever it was had been here not long before she arrived. A mounted rider, watching or just passing through. But in a storm like this, nobody reached the birch grove by accident. Maggie's eyes swept the pale forest, but saw nothing beyond the curtain of falling snow. The chill she felt now didn't come from the wind. It came from knowing Jacob had been out here, alone, while someone else lingered nearby. By the time they reached the house, Samuel was back. He strode out when he saw them, and Maggie handed Jacob into his arms, giving a brief account of what had happened. Samuel's face hardened, his gaze drifting toward the grove. He said nothing, just squeezed her shoulder and carried Jacob inside. That night, while the wind slapped the windows like giant hands, Maggie sat by the stove, her coat still damp from the snow. In her mind, the image of those hoof prints looped over and over. They tied too neatly to the fragments she'd overheard at the depot weeks ago. About the lawyer coming. About rumors sharp enough to be used as weapons. She wondered if the two were connected. A man wanting leverage on Samuel might not hesitate to strike where it hurt most. through the one thing he could never lose, his child. Maggie's grip tightened on the wooden horse in her lap. Tomorrow, she would tell Samuel. He might brush it off, call it a hunter who'd wandered off course. But deep down, she knew those prints were no accident. And here, where the white wind could wipe away every trace in a single night, if they didn't act fast, the proof would vanish as if it had never been. She glanced toward the bedroom, where Jacob now slept soundly, his small face hidden beneath the heavy quilt. Maggie let out a long breath. Out here on the far edge of the West, snowstorms weren't the only thing that could chill a person to the bone. There were other winds, unseen, but just as fierce, that could sweep away everything, unless you stood your ground. The warmth of the kitchen wrapped around them like a quilt that had been waiting all along. Outside, the wind still howled around the eaves, but once the door closed, it sealed them off from the white world beyond. Maggie stayed kneeling beside Jacob, brushing away the crusted snow clinging to his coat, her hands trembling from the cold, but never leaving him. Samuel stood at the door, breathing hard, steam rising from his hair and the shoulders of his coat. The boy clung to her hand as if letting go might send the storm reaching back to pull him toward that split birch trunk. Maggie eased his fingers open, setting his hands over a small wooden bowl by the stove to warm them. The scent of burning pine mingled with the faint smell of morning bread still lingering in the air. Samuel came closer, crouching beside his son. But instead of just pulling the boy into his chest, he looked up at Maggie. His eyes were different now, none of the guarded distance, none of the ice from those first days. He spoke slowly, each word carrying the weight of a long road from his heart to his mouth. "Thank you for bringing my boy home." Just 4 plain words, yet to Maggie they landed like a truth she'd never expected to hear. It wasn't politeness. It wasn't filler to close the silence. It was a fact, spoken by a man who put his trust in actions more than speech. Jacob looked from his father to Maggie, as if he too understood something had shifted. He smiled, a small, bright thing, and it was the first smile Maggie had seen from him since she'd come to this house. Samuel rose and went to the stove. He didn't tell her to move aside, didn't take over stoking the fire like before. Instead, he fetched another chair, set it beside hers, and motioned for her to sit. When she hesitated, he said simply, "Sit. You're cold too." She did, not because of the words, but because there was something softer in the way he placed that chair. A place beside him, not across from him. The fire cracked and popped in the stove. Maggie slipped off her snow-damp cloak, hanging it near the heat to dry. Droplets ran down onto the wood floor, leaving dark marks. Samuel poured tea from the iron kettle, steam curling up to chase away the chill left in the room. He set a cup in front of her, one for himself and one for Jacob. She took it, feeling the heat seep into her fingers, like fresh blood finding its way through cold veins. She murmured her thanks. Samuel only nodded, his gaze fixed on the boy, making sure he truly was safe. Later, when Jacob began to yawn, Samuel carried him into his room and tucked the quilt snug around him. Maggie stayed at the table, listening to his footsteps return. He leaned in the doorway, shoulder against the frame, his face still touched by fatigue but steadier now. "When I saw both your tracks coming back," he said, his voice slow, "I knew you'd done more than I could have asked." Maggie smiled faintly, not at the compliment, but at hearing him speak without the half-walls of guarded phrases. "I only did what needed doing," she said, quiet but sure. Samuel moved closer, sitting across from her. Not everyone does what needs doing. Not in a blizzard. He paused, then added, Jacob, he needs someone like you around. The words stitched shut a gap between them. Not a tie of duty or law, but something softer and stronger. Like the patient stitches Samuel had sewn into Jacob's wool scarf to keep it warm and whole. Outside, the wind was easing, leaving only the slow drift of snow into the yard. In the kitchen, the firelight cast a warmth over their faces, more certain than any promise could be. Maggie took another sip of tea and realized that the feeling of being an outsider had taken a step back. Not gone, but now there was something between her and Samuel that didn't need a name. She didn't ask about the strange hoof prints she'd seen in the birch grove. Not because she'd forgotten, but because she knew this night wasn't for troubles. It was for warmth, and for the rare moment of seeing the same direction together. Samuel didn't ask why she'd risked herself to find Jacob. Some questions already held their answers in the way two people came back through a storm side by side. Before they turned in, he placed another log in the stove. As he rose, he said quietly, If there's ever something, you tell me. Don't keep it to yourself. Maggie nodded, and in her heart, she knew it wasn't just about the snowstorm. From that moment on, even with the land still buried under white, something else in the kitchen began to thaw. No one said it aloud, but both knew the road from stranger to family starts with small things like this. That morning, the sky stretched thin under a pale sheet of cloud drifting slow over the prairie. The last of winter's chill rode the wind across the grasslands, hissing through the patches of old snow that crunched under iron shoes. Out back, Samuel was splitting wood. Maggie sat near the kitchen table, mending one of Jacob's shirts, while the boy played on the floor with his wooden horse. Old, paint-chipped, but still the most precious thing he owned. The first sound to break the quiet wasn't birdsong or the hum of the windmill. It was the steady, deliberate thud of hoofbeats. Maggie froze, needle mid-stitch. Samuel had heard it too. He set the wood aside, wiped his hands on his shirt, and fixed his gaze on the road leading in. The rider emerged, growing larger through a drift of thin morning haze. He wore a long black coat, trimmed with gray sheepskin at the collar. Under the wide brim of his hat, his hair was streaked with iron, his face scored with lines, not just the years, but the kind carved into men who give orders and expect them followed. Thomas Kane, owner of one of the largest spreads in the territory, and a name the town spoke with equal parts caution and fear. Kane pulled up in the middle of the yard, snow dust kicking against his boots. He didn't dismount, only leaned on the saddle horn, his cold gray eyes sweeping the house, the land, then settling on Maggie. Samuel, Kane said, each word slow and heavy. I hear tell there's a woman living here. No husband, no paper to her name. The law around here don't much care for that sort of thing. You follow me? The chill that ran through Maggie wasn't from the wind. It was in the way he looked at her, like she was a stain on white cloth, something to be scrubbed out so the world sat back in order. Samuel stepped forward, guarded but steady. If you came here to talk land, we can do it inside. If you came here to talk about my personal life, I'd watch my step if I were you. Kane's smile was a winter thing, thin and without warmth. Around here, land and personal life walk the same trail. Word is, that woman's liable to drag your name through the mud. And when that happens, it won't just be your reputation. This land'll belong to someone else. Seems there are a few cracks in your deed. My lawyer's eager to take a look." Maggie rose, folding the shirt she'd been mending. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried across the space between them. "Then I reckon you've also heard the talk about how I brought Jacob home out of a blizzard last week. How, when others stayed inside by the fire, I followed every small track through the snow to keep him alive. Or how I've kept this household like it was my own." Kane's brow lifted. He hadn't expected her to meet his stare. "Good deeds don't wash away what the law says, ma'am." "No," Maggie said, holding his gaze. "But they sure as hell prove I'm not the kind of woman you're trying to paint me as. You can twist rumor into a threat, but you can't bend the truth just to suit yourself." Silence swelled, filled only by the wind against the fence. Samuel stepped up beside her, his voice dropping into a sharp, measured edge. "Kane, I'll tell you once, don't think you can take my land with cheap tricks. You step onto this place, you leave with clean hands. You want to try otherwise, I'll see you in court. And I promise you won't like how it ends." The two men locked eyes, tension strung tight as a bowline. At last, Kane drew back on the reins. His horse surged a step, then wheeled toward the open prairie. "I'll remember your words, Samuel, clear as day." His voice trailed cold in the wind. When the hoofbeats finally faded, Samuel exhaled slow, the steel in his shoulders easing. Maggie still stood rooted, fingers clenched on the hem of her skirt. "He'll be back," she said, not as a warning, but as a fact. "Maybe," Samuel answered, eyes still on the horizon where Kane had vanished. "But next time, he'll know exactly who he's up against. Not just me, but you too." Later, in the warmth of the kitchen, as they cleared the breakfast that had gone cold, Maggie realized something. What happened out there in the yard wasn't just about land or rumor. It was a line in the dirt. And they'd both stood on the same side of it. Neither of them said it aloud, but that morning had changed the ground beneath their feet. The wooden gate swung shut behind Thomas Kane, his hoofbeats fading across the frozen ground. Silence returned, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that usually settled over the Carter place. This was the stillness before a lake locks under ice, tight, cold, holding on to every echo of what had just been said. Maggie stayed on the porch, her hand resting lightly on the post, her breath turning to pale smoke in the bitter air. Samuel didn't speak. He walked to the gate, slid the bolt home, then turned for the house. In that simple movement, she could feel it. Kane hadn't just left a warning. He'd left a shadow draped over the roof. Inside, Samuel stripped off his frost-stiffened gloves and set them on the table. He didn't look directly at her, just sat down near the stove and worked his hands together for warmth. Maggie fed the fire, the flames licking higher, catching the tired lines in his face. "The bracelet," Samuel said at last, his voice low, as though testing the weight of the words in the kitchen air. "He just mentioned Elise Carter." Maggie froze. She didn't ask right away, but the memory was already flooding back. That first week here, finding it tucked away in the storeroom. A finely worked silver bracelet, buried among the old things. She'd thought it was just some family keepsake and left it alone out of respect. Now, it felt different. Elise Carter. That name wasn't just a scratch in the past. It might be a wound that had never closed. Maggie drew a breath and decided not to hide it. "I saw it, the first week I came, in the storeroom. I didn't touch it, but... Samuel looked up, his gaze layered, part guarded, part measuring whether to let her step into that closed-off corner of his life. At last, he gave a short nod. You don't need to apologize. But Cain, he knows more than he ought to. Outside, the wind began to rake the roof, as if reminding them winter still had plenty of fight left. Maggie sat across from him, hands wrapped around a steaming mug. So this, Elise Carter, what is it? Samuel was silent for a long time, long enough for the crackle of the fire to fill the space between them. Finally, he answered, not telling it all, just enough to set the shape of the ghost. She was my wife. The words dropped like a chunk of ice, sinking deep. Maggie didn't ask why they were no longer together, or why Cain could smile like a man holding a trump card at the mention of her name. But she knew something about it wasn't clean, and it had been waiting just outside this door long before she ever crossed the threshold. That night, after Samuel and Jacob had gone to bed, Maggie stayed by the fire. The flames had settled low, casting her shadow long across the floorboards. She pulled her shawl tight, trying to shake the feeling of being watched from out there, where the wind and the dark knotted into shifting shapes. She thought of the day she'd found Jacob in the Somme blizzard, the strange hoof prints circling the birch tree. And now, with Cain's eyes and voice fresh in her mind, the pieces fit together in a way that made her skin prickle. Had it been him out there, watching the boy? Her fingers found the chain at her neck, not Elise's, but her mother's worn silver. Part habit, part reminder she still had roots, even on land that wasn't hers. By morning, the sky had turned to solid gray, snow falling light but steady. Samuel went to the barn early. He didn't talk more than usual, but Maggie noticed the way his eyes lingered on the road in and out. Jacob was cheerful enough, but now and then he glanced toward the window, as if expecting someone. Later, kneading bread dough in the kitchen, Maggie caught the faint drum of hoofbeats. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, only to see a small group riding past with a wagon of firewood. Still, the unease clung to her, as if Cain had planted a seed that made her suspicious of every sound and shadow. By late afternoon, Samuel was back with a load of cut logs. He set them down, wiped his brow, and told her, "If Cain comes again, you don't have to step outside. Let me deal with him." Maggie gripped the edge of the table. Part of her wanted to agree, but another part knew she couldn't stay behind the door. Last time, her words had made Cain pause, even if only for a moment. She was part of the fence around this place now, not just a guest under its roof. The second night after Cain's visit, freezing rain rattled against the windows like a steady knock. Maggie woke in the dark, unsure if it was the cold or a pull in her gut. She slipped on her shawl and padded down the hall. From Jacob's room came the faint rustle of him turning in his sleep. But outside the window, for the briefest flicker, she saw a tall shadow on the snow, gone in the next gust, as if it had never been. Her pulse jumped. At dawn, fresh hoofprints marked the snow leading away from the gate. Samuel said nothing, only crouched to study them, then walked straight to the shed. When he came back out, he carried the Winchester, wiping it clean, the metal catching the gray light. Maggie knew then whatever story lay behind Elise Carter's name, Cain was a real and present threat, and they would have to be ready, not just with gunpowder, but with the kind of resolve that lives in every small choice they made from here on. That morning didn't start with the crow of a rooster or the grind of wagon wheels on dirt. It began with the scent of fresh bread drifting through the kitchen. Spring light slipped past the coarse curtain, painting the room in a soft gold, nothing like the fierce, unblinking yellow of a western summer. Maggie was tying her hair back, hands dusted with flour, when she heard Samuel's steady boots crossing the porch. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, his shadow filling the doorway like a bold line across a quiet painting. In his hands, he held something folded, its fabric worn pale with years. When she turned, their eyes met, without the guarded edge of months past, without the distance of two strangers bound under the same roof. Samuel stepped forward, set the bundle on the table. This, he cleared his throat, belonged to Elise. The name still sounded like a far-off echo, but this time it carried neither frost nor pain, only a calm acknowledgement. Maggie looked down. It was an old apron, the edges frayed but holding strong, smelling faintly of pine wood and cook fire. "No ring to give you," Samuel went on, his gaze steady on hers. "But there's the land, this house, and the children. You stepped into an empty place here, and I believe that place isn't empty anymore." She stood still, her fingers tracing the worn seams as if touching another woman's life. The apron wasn't just cloth. It was the mark of hands that once lit this hearth, fed this family. And now it was given to her, not as a replacement, but as a quiet recognition that she'd become part of this home. Maggie nodded, the corner of her mouth lifting. It wasn't a broad or dazzling smile, more like a drop of honey sinking into hot tea, spreading warmth from the inside out. The children tumbled in, Jacob with his little sister, hair still tousled from sleep. The boy stopped when he saw the apron. "That's," Jacob began, but Samuel ruffled his hair. "It's Maggie's now." Both children studied her, weighing it in the small court of their world, then smiled together, a silent, weighty kind of approval. By midday, with the sun climbing higher and spring wind carrying warmth into the yard, Maggie opened her small chest. From the bottom, she brought out two wooden birds, one she'd found in Samuel's workshop, wings nicked but eyes set on a far horizon, the other carved clumsily by the children's small hands, rough but brimming with life. She walked out to the porch where the winter wind chimes once hung. Rope was tied firm, and the two birds swayed side by side in the breeze. The wind whistled through the porch railings, mixing with the soft tap of wooden wings. A heartbeat settled after a long road. Samuel stood on the steps, arms folded, watching her. He didn't ask why two birds, but she knew he understood. One was him, quiet, burdened, steady. One was the children, new to the wind, learning how to fly. And the rope between them was what she had quietly become, the link holding them together. By evening, the clouds over the far ridge burned red. Maggie sat on the porch steps, the newly given apron now dusted with flour from the pies she'd baked. The children played tag in the yard, their laughter chasing off the long shadow of winter. Samuel came out with a mug of hot coffee, setting it beside her. "Not every porch hangs wooden birds," he said, voice low but warm under the wind. "Not every porch gets the wind to lift them," she replied, eyes still on the children. "And not every home has a place for them." He was quiet a moment, then nodded. His look was no longer one of cautious measure, but of a man who knows the worth of what he has, and means to keep it. That night, With the house wrapped in silence, Maggie stood at her bedroom window. Outside, the two birds swayed in the dark, moonlight catching on their carved wings. She thought of Cain's threats, of the silver bracelet etched with Elise's name, of the mysteries yet unanswered. But she also thought of the coffee on the porch, the children's laughter, and Samuel's eyes when he handed her the apron. Life would still have its trials. Men like Cain. Secrets from the past. Winters yet to come. But tomorrow, when sunlight spilled past the curtain and the smell of baking bread filled the kitchen, she'd know she was in the right place, doing the right thing, with the right people. And for Maggie, that was a foundation strong enough to call by one name: family. Sometimes, home isn't where you're born. It's where your heart finally chooses to rest. And for those who've weathered enough winters, you learn that happiness isn't in grand gestures. It's in mornings where someone's waiting for you at the kitchen table, in the wooden birds swinging on the porch, in the warmth you can always come back to.